folks, welcome back to Game Geeks. I'm Kurt Wiegel. Today's episode is going to be a slightly bit more ethereal than most of what we've done because with the modern nature of publishing, with the direction that most things are going, the applications and the use of PDFs and e-readers and tablets is going to become more and more, certainly not less, inclusive and important for how we do our hobby. So for a good chunk of today's review, I'm actually going to be referring to the books that are on PDF form on my iPad, which means that I don't have as much cool things to hold up in front of you, but they're just as accessible and just as easy for me to get my hands on, look through them, etc. Today's episode, we are going to be going through a rather lengthy review of the current state of the Doctor Who role-playing game line produced by Cubicle 7. Also, as part of this review, we're going to be appending on to the same group of ideas the Primeval role-playing game, seen here, also published by Cubicle 7. Now, I want to go ahead and get this established up front so there's no complaining, there's no grousing that I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm completely well aware that Primeval is not part of the Doctor Who universe. They're even produced by different television networks. Doctor Who is the property of the BBC, and Primeval is the property of Impossible Pictures, which comes through, from what I understand, as a slightly different network on British television. I will admit my ignorance of not knowing about all things British and broadcast. So, before we dive into this review, starting about the current state of the Doctor Who line, I have to give you a little bit of backstory here. And I promise this isn't going to become a Harry Knowles wondering point about what I'm talking about or get near what you're going to do here, Kurt. I kind of feel like the background here is pretty important. I've been a Doctor Who fan since I was about 7 years old, which puts it at about 34 years plus or minus this year, with me being 41. I first discovered the television show by accident as it aired at 6 o'clock on the local PBS station from my small town in Ohio. And I started out watching Tom Baker episodes. I was instantly enthralled by this half-hour serialized program with a lot of strange accents that I did not understand. I was 7 years old in rural Ohio. It's not exactly a cosmopolitan area. I got really sucked into this. My parents seemed to be amused by this new obsession, if for no other reason than it got me in a different room eating dinner so they could have a few quiet moments alone in the kitchen, while I was eating dinner in the living room at a small card table, watching the antics of this guy named the Doctor and his companion, who was either a reporter named Sarah Jane Smith or this crazy barbarian woman whose name was Leela. One of the oddities about this program was they apparently only had the rights to air those two sets of episodes, Sarah Jane and Leela, because by the time they would work through all of those, they would start over back at the beginning. I had no idea that there was a time frame before the Doctor, other than this rather odd sort of weird half-glimpsed images in the brain of Morbius, where you saw the previous versions through what I believe they called Time Lord arm wrestling. It sort of put me on this rather odd path. About the same time I discovered Dungeons & Dragons. One of the more interesting pieces about it from my point of view is how I would rediscover it in high school, where it didn't re-air at a normal time. I actually had to get up at 2:30 in the morning to go downstairs and make sure that the VCR was recording, because that's when they aired the episodes out of Columbus instead of Dayton. So it was a much grainier image. It would go up after old OSU marching band viewings, and occasionally a train would go by and completely mess up reception. But this is when I understood that there were other doctors like John Pertwee and Peter Davison, Colin Baker, etc. Now, going from that into this point, I am very excited that Doctor Who, in the current hands that it is being produced, has become a real pop culture phenomenon. I'm excited that it's on the cover of TV Guide, Entertainment Weekly, that you can find Doctor Who stuff, memorabilia or toys or stuffed talking Daleks. I'm still not sure how I feel about that one. At Books A Million or at Borders. So it's really good. The flip side to that is I'm sort of used to Doctor Who being almost like my secret nerd shame that only a small handful of nerdy people would know about, and that we could sort of share in our pain that no one understood us and that we never liked Star Trek and that Doctor Who is better and blah, blah, blah. It is also, for me, one of the only moments of true soul-incinerating nerd rage that I've ever had in my 41 years, when a couple years ago I had a student who informed me that, oh, well, the old series really sucked and it doesn't really count, so they don't consider it as anything, and only the stuff that Eccleston, Tennant, and Smith have gotten their hands on really counts as canon Doctor Who. I still have to calm down a few minutes after I hear that. It was just, I'm normally pretty good about this stuff, but that was the one moment where I just completely nerded out on someone, and I'm still kind of proud of some of what I said. That's for a later episode. All right, I'm done proselytizing about all of that. Doctor Who role-playing games, I have the books all the way back to the Fossa era when they had the most obscurely and inappropriately tactical game sort of spot-welded onto a Doctor Who setting. The current editions of the rules are what they call the 11th Doctor rules. They are substantially the same, a few minor tweaks here and there, but they are by and large the same as were experienced with the original production of this line, also by Cubicle 7, which featured the David Tennant era episodes. So what you have with the Doctor Who game is a fairly rules-light, straightforward role-playing game where you are able, allowed, or encouraged to play the Doctor or any one of companions, or your new sort of setting. Now, along these lines, the game engine itself is set up to really strongly emulate the feel of the TV series. That is, talkers go before anyone else. I think the order goes talkers, runners, doers, fighters. Those middle two might be inverted. I don't have it right in front of me. And sort of emulates why the Daleks or the Cybermen or the Sontarans don't just kill him on sight, and why he can talk himself through that. More on that in a minute. The game itself has a rather clever idea of most of the roles are attribute plus skill, 2d6, look for a target number. There are varying degrees of success. One of the more interesting pieces about this, though, is that damage is a lower number than you'd be expected. So something might be a 3 or a 6 or a 5 or L's. Talk about that in just a sec. But the damage then is applied directly to your attributes. So that if you are physically injured by falling, being shot, etc., that comes off of those attributes, those lower, which affects your overall rolls. So it does sort of simulate that spiral of death that we're used to in some other role-playing games that don't actively embrace hit points, but at the same time allows a certain amount of latitude there. Does it result in the sprained ankle that was so commonly plaguing all of the original Doctor and his companions? If you have the opportunity, please go back and watch the Daleks, the second major story arc of the first Doctor. Everyone in that series sprains their ankle at one point or another over those 7 or 8 episodes, including the Doctor. It was that great tradition of why you have to slow down and you can't run from the monster that's menacing you. So along those lines, the gear itself, the gadgets have their own attributes and the things that you can do, including the ability to have the sonic screwdriver do something that you've never before seen, but you need it right then at that moment, not unlike welding together barbed wire as we saw in the Doctor Dances. Along those lines, one of the things that has happened from updating from the 10th to the 11th Doctor set of the rules is that some of the non-player characters that were seen exclusively with the 10th Doctor are no longer included in this set. So if you're a big fan of Rose, Martha, Donna, or Captain Jack Harkness, Barrowman, if you happen to be watching this, I love you dearly, then those are not included with the 11th Doctor stuff, but you can certainly go back and find those from the old, and the backwards compatibility is almost flawless. So you've got the rules that is really set up nicely in the boxes so that you have the player's guide, the game master's guide, story points, which are sort of the fuel for how the characters can take control of the narrative flow of the story, gadget cards, and a couple of adventures. So the first major supplement that was produced for this, we've reviewed before. It's Doctor Who, Aliens and Creatures. I won't give it a great deal of attention simply because, as I mentioned, we've looked at it before, but it's going to get brought up here just for completeness sake. This gives you a much broader cut of things with which to challenge your players. So the major villains, your Daleks, Cybermen, Sontarans, those are pretty well over almost all of the materials, both for the 10th and the 11th Doctors because they pop up a lot. But let's say that you're interested in having the Vashta Nerada, or the Adipose, or the Toclafane, or say the Arachnos Empire. These are all presented in these books, in this Monsters and Creatures Guide, which works out really nicely. Most of this was written specifically for the 10th Doctor. Most of the 11th Doctor things are included in that book as well. So if you're really into a lot with the Weeping Angels beyond just Don't Blink, or to a certain extent, say, the Silence, then you're pretty well there too. River Song is also exhaustively described in the 11th Doctor book. The aliens and creatures also sort of broaden out some other stuff you can do to create your own. And what really made me pretty darn happy was there are hints to the older continuity in this book as well. For example, under Cybermen, you don't just get the Cybus Industries or the spin-offs from the parallel Earth. You also hear about Mondas, you hear about Telos, and you see several eras of the other Cybermen as well, and some ideas about what some of their strengths and weaknesses, etc. may be. For example, the original Cybermen, as seen in most of the later part of the original series, were very allergic to gold, which meant there was a real useful, if expensive, weapon that you could use to kill them. Ironically enough, there was a race that had the glitter gun, which shot gold glitter flakes at monsters, which to me sort of portends the arrival of Lady Gaga and Kesha as the ultimate warriors against the Cybermen. But I digress. So there's your aliens and creatures, as well as the ability to tack together some of your own, as well as some of the alien planets that your characters might want to visit. Now we're going to get into the unit source book, which is called Doctor Who Unit Defending the Earth. One of the nice things that I really like about this is the fact that they reference that UNIT used to stand for United Nations Intelligence Task Force, and now with the newer series, it's United Intelligence Task Force. It really doesn't matter. It's the same sort of thing. This gives you a really nice background on the organization from its inception to the modern days. It goes back into a lot of the Troughton era, where the Brigadier and some of the elements of UNIT were first introduced, through the Pertwee era, where he was effectively working with them, into Tom Baker, Davison, Baker. Most of UNIT sort of disappeared about partway through Tom Baker, popped up again later on, but the Brigadier was a regular character who popped up a lot in the series, which was sort of really the saddest moment for me toward the end of the most recently completed Matt Smith season, when they referenced the fact that the Brigadier was there and that he had passed away. Stop fussing at me about spoilers. It's 2 years old. Keep up. All right. So what does the unit book give you that you don't have from the other stuff? Well, obviously, a direct line into a more militaristic game. There's a lot of what I consider kind of winking at the camera here, where you could use this for unit, or you could strip mine parts of this and use a Torchwood sort of application for your game. Interestingly, I think, and I'm not positive on this, but I'm pretty sure that Torchwood and Doctor Who are slightly different properties, such that it would be very difficult to make a Torchwood game with that official name, because there would be a series of other channels you have to go to. Some of Torchwood is canon in Doctor Who, so there can be a certain amount of winking at the camera that goes on there. One of the nicer things about this is it gives the GM some ideas about a more physical, more violent sort of game, if that's your cup of tea. There's also the ways to build your unit base from which your players are adventuring. So it can be your standard military type base, as we saw with most of the Third Doctor episodes. It could be a mobile base, like a big flying airplane, or you could have the Valiant, or even it's a stationary base, but there's a lot of weird crap that goes on around it that you could certainly have space-time issues nearby, it's haunted, there's all sorts of bad juju with it. There are traits that you can apply, both positive and negative, to your base, so it can be just other than, it's a big giant warehouse with 3 computers, a cage, and a rack of guns, where it could have a history. It could have other things that are good or bad about it that are beyond your ability. You set them up as the players, but then you sort of hand that to the GM to make things easier or harder for you, depending on which way you want to go. Additionally, like I said, you could very easily throw some of those and make a new Torchwood base. I know a lot of people don't like Torchwood. I happen to really dig it, so it's going to get referenced quite a bit in here. All right. There's also this idea about how do you cover up some of these things that you see. So The nice thing about the unit book is the fact that it really gives you a bunch of new options. And I like, as these supplements have gone on, that they have really kind of grown to encompass a lot more than just canon Who. The other thing I like about these, Unit does it. It was mentioned back in Monsters and Aliens and Creatures. Now we're at Unit, and then we're about to get into what I'll try to minimize my love on for. But that really ties in, again, some of the older series mythology. Small side note into something else, Cubicle 7 has started releasing, as 2013 is the 50th anniversary of the television show, that they've started releasing books dealing specifically with the older era of the Time Lords. So available at the time of this filming as a PDF is the Doctor Who Adventures in Time and Space First Doctor Sourcebook, which gives you statistics for the first Doctor, that grumpy old man, and some of his most of his companions as far as I can tell, including the few that don't quite make it very far, and sort of the monsters, the creatures, the first time these pop up. For example, the meddling monk is first seen in the first Doctor episode. So is the Celestial Toymaker, which for those of you who are paying attention, the Celestial Toymaker was played by the same man who also was one of the Time Lords in the later episodes. And for those of us who are really plugged into this level of odd reality, Michael Gough, who was the Alfred for the Tim Burton era and then Joel Schumacher era Batman movies. But this isn't to discuss how Joel Schumacher was Batman's greatest enemy. This is about Doctor Who. So they're coming out with each one of these Doctors within a certain time frame. They're very interesting, and it's very reminiscent, especially if you remember some of those old episodes. The next one we're going to discuss is a very large book. It clocks in at 242 pages with the PDF alone. This is the Doctor Who Time Traveler's Companion. I will lay this out very bluntly for everyone. I have literally had dreams throughout my life of going to a bookstore and finding a book that is the history of Gallifrey. I have had dreams about going into a bookstore and finding a TARDIS design manual. I understand this labels me of being a certain age and of being a certain obsession with this particular property. But earlier this year, 2013, I was noodling around with an idea for a game, and I started plunking around, asking a couple questions on online fora here and there, and somebody says, "Have you seen this?" Now, I've been very blessed in that I've gotten a lot of books for review. I'm very fortunate that way. And this is one that landed on my lap as an idea. I poked around, I tried to get it, when then I realized that why I can't spell traveler is exactly why I couldn't find it in one of my email accounts for which I tend to get offers for PDFs for review purposes. I have a PhD, I've never claimed to be smart. So what do you get in the Time Traveler's Companion? This is, in a lot of ways, that book that I have been looking for all of my life. This is an extremely well-written, detailed analysis of the history of Gallifrey, the origins of time travel, the timey-wimey physics that goes into understanding time travel, vortex issues, etc. with Doctor Who, as well as expansions on other time-traveling races. There's not much mention of Jack or the Time Agency, which I was a little on, but again, that goes back heavily into the 9th and 10th Doctor era, and most of the current materials deal a lot more in the modern era with Matt Smith era Doctor Who. It gives you ideas for different kinds of TARDISes, from the old archaic to the Model 40, which is what the Doctor's rattling around in, to some of the more advanced TARDISes, including battle TARDISes or war TARDISes, as were trotted out during the last Great Time War. I'm starting to drool. There's also a lot of information about how a time war can operate, what happened in the battles between the Daleks and the Doctor. The Daleks and the Time Lords in the last Great Time War. How to build more Time Lord characters, interactions with the Matrix, which is this great source of information and the collective knowledge of all Time Lords with the virtual reality interactions. Go to hell, Wachowski brothers, they did it first. There's also all this stuff about how you can use fissures and time loops and spurs and alternate realities and how you can tie all of those back in. There's also these ideas about why the Daleks and the Cybermen and the Centaurans can't just kill the Doctor right away, because he's wrapped up in all of these timelines and in all of this stuff, and you never know which Doctor you're going to kill, if it's going to completely screw up all of these other things that have been along the way for you and lock you away in your own little timelines, which means that you don't exist, which is why when they had all the Doctor's enemies on him at once, they didn't kill him, they locked him away in something else, so that way they didn't have to worry about their little universes or their little realities imploding. And it talks about how you can hop from reality to reality and the Artron energy, and how because the Gallifreyans were the first major civilization to put their footprint on the universe, that there was a morphic field set up based on their structure and their reality, which is why humans look like they do, which is why we look like Time Lords, which is in reality because they didn't feel like taping lettuce to people's heads to make them the big aliens, and then why we don't look like the Rachnos or the Nestine and all of these other prime civilizations. And when I got this book, my family had gotten a movie to watch that evening. I excused myself from watching The Odd Life of Timothy Green, which I'm sure is a very fine film, to sequester myself in my bedroom with this book on my computer and flip through it and continue to drool. A lot of my friends had several major comments about my obsession with that book at this time that I cannot mention in the courses of this review because it's a family show, but I'll let you fill in what that was. I also emerged about 3-4 hours later with an extremely satisfied look on my face, as I had just achieved a lifelong goal to have a book in my hand that describes how you can set up your control system of your TARDIS. And a lot of the old controls that you saw once or twice but never really saw again, like the telepathic circuit relays and how all of that works. Folks, if you are a Doctor Who fan, you owe it to yourself to chase down this book, simply because it fills in a lot of the gaps of the history, of the knowledge, and of that spot in your heart that gets really warm when you hear the grinding sound of the TARDIS, or when you hear the Doctor Who theme music in any of its iterations. And I will be the first to admit that I think the theme song for the Fox 1996 series is probably my favorite version of that, just because it sounds so damn biblical. And the TARDIS design is probably my favorite from that as well, just because it looked like what I thought an inside of a TARDIS would finally look like. It gives you options for changing the desktop theme of your TARDIS and how to tie in a very broadly applied all-Time Lord game, both before, during, and potentially after the Time War. Now, I've given a lot of love to the Doctor Who engine here. I'm going to kind of throw the handbrake just a touch and kick over to Primeval, principally because the engine, almost everything about the Doctor Who game applies to Primeval as well. The only significant difference is the introduction of an animal... Pause. The only significant changes are the introduction of an animal handling skill to Primeval, which, if you've watched the show at all, you know what this is about. There's also a slight difference in how the damage works and how the combat system works, because, I'm sorry, you're not going to try to talk down that Velociraptor no matter how hard you try, and if you do, you kind of deserve what you get. Pause.
Good.
How far in are we?
What?
How far in are we?
85, 13 minutes?
Oh, that's all?
I think so.
Okay,
62,
good.
Wait, 85, 75. Yeah, I think, well, it might be 18 minutes.
Okay, I'm about to wrap up.
Okay, I'm going to, on all of it or just the one?
Just this one.
Okay, I'm going to go help Janet move some stuff out. I'll be back, but you're doing good.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll be back.
For those of you who don't know what the TV show is about, it is essentially about the fact that space-time anomalies exist in England, specifically around the forest of... Pause. For those of you who don't know what the Primeval TV series is about, it is specifically about space-time anomalies that allow dinosaurs to come through into our modern era. As the TV show has expanded, it goes into different time zones as well, including a possible vision of future Earth with these weird mutated bat predator monsters. There's a lot of good in the TV show. I happen to be a fan of it, including the Canadian version, which ran for one season recently, and then sort of didn't get renewed. I actually liked it, but I also thought that Miracle Day had a lot of life to it. It was just about twice as long as it should have been. So with Primeval, you have stats for a whole bunch of prehistoric and futuristic monsters, a slightly more physical approach, not unlike what you see in Unit, as well as some of the same base construction, team construction, qualities, drawbacks, etc. The Primeval game ends right up before sort of some of the last two series that dealt with the privatization of some of the Anomaly Research Center, Dr. Bashir joining the TV series, etc. I like Primeval, the game, quite a bit, principally because it can perfectly tie into Doctor Who if you wanted it to. I can very easily see a parallel dimension or a parallel reality where your characters sort of fall through a time shunt or some sort of time eddy, get stuck over in this other reality where there are space-time issues, and you end up running from dinosaurs into your TARDIS as opposed to running away from Sontarans or Rutans. So there's a lot of life here. If you have the Doctor Who game, this has a lot of nice add-ons for it. If you don't like Doctor Who, why the heck are you watching this show? But if you don't like Doctor Who, then the Primeval game itself does give you a lot more of just different options and ideas. I personally feel like you can spot weld the two together effortlessly and be able to have some way of coming up with your own reality where they both exist. Tell me that the Doctor or your renegade Time Lord of choice, who's not, say, the Master or Ronnie or War Chief, Meddling Monk wasn't really that bad. So one of those sort of big nasty ones who wouldn't want to find a way to stop Tyrannosaurs from stomping down Main Street Manhattan. Or you could have one of the more unpleasant Time Lords, the Doctor, the Master, the Ronnie, the War Chief, using that in some way to their advantage. For those of you who have really sharp memories, you'll remember that early on in the introduction of the Ronnie, she had embryonic tyrannosaurs growing inside of her TARDIS, and when the sixth Doctor, Colin Baker, I don't care what you think, he is my absolute favorite for reasons that I'm not going to go into right now, but just trust me, he is. I seem to really like Doctors that are divisible by 3. I like Pertwee, Colin Baker, and Eccleston the most, so I would really love whoever they pull for 12. But either way, for those of you who remember the Ronnie episode, Mark of the Ronnie, the Doctor jury-rigs her TARDIS, and she and the Master are spun out of control through the vortex as a Tyrannosaur, badly done inflatable puppet, falls off of a very poorly and precariously placed pillar and starts to grow inside of the control room of her TARDIS. Also, in Time in the Ronnie, which is when 6 regenerated to 7, she also had some sort of like mutant bat people henchmen there too that I suppose you could say are like the future predators from Primeval. But there's a lot of way that you can tie these together, not simply by basic theme of time travel and science fiction, but also by dint of they use almost an identical engine that can fit together utterly seamlessly. To summarize, because I realize I've rattled on for a while here, and I hope that you're still watching, we have the Doctor Who game as it is currently being presented and published by Cubicle 7, both the 10th and 11th Doctor iterations, Aliens and Creatures, the first Doctor sourcebook, which is currently available. I'm sure we'll have Troughton and Pertwee before too much longer. And then also the Unit sourcebook, Defending the Earth, and the Time Traveler's Companion, which I'm actually having to cut myself off from continuing to talk to you about how amazingly transcendent that particular book is. For Game Geeks, I'm your host, Kurt Wiegel. Good day and good gaming.